All right, welcome everyone. So excited to be here with you today for our June webinar on how to build a resilient team through psychological safety. So I'm so excited to be here with all of you today. I see there are hellos coming through in the chat. Feel free to keep those coming as I get us kicked off and started with our topic for today. Briefly, my name is Felicia. For those of you who know me already, you know all of this. So great to see you again here. For those of you who this is the first time that you're attending one of our Inclusion Geek webinars, I am one of the co-founders of Inclusion Geeks. My other co-founder, Rachel, is on the um, is on the line and she will be holding it down on the chat. So if you have any questions, you are more than welcome to go ahead and she'll be on it in terms of answering you really quickly while I'm facilitating this. I'm based out in Western Massachusetts and Rachel's out in San Diego. So as I mentioned earlier, we are holding it down on both sides of the country. A little bit about me. I am someone who is a cat parent. I use she, her pronouns. I geek out about lots of things, including local government, pottery, and ghosts. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. What we're really here to talk about is psychological safety and how can we really support a climate where we are working together as teammates and really building our mutual resiliency. So let's get into it. A couple ways that you can engage with us during today's webinar is definitely by using the chat. That's probably our favorite way of engaging with you all during the next hour. So I see the chat is already in use. So keep it coming. We love to chat with you all, and that's something that we will be keeping an eye on. We will be using a tool called Slido to get some engagement. So if that's something that you would like to engage with further beyond just sharing in the chat, make sure you have a device that can scan a QR code handy. So that could be your phone or some other sort of device that you have nearby. If you don't have a device, no worries. You can also use the website. I'll talk us through it when we get to that point. So don't worry about that right now. You can use the raise hand feature. We will have some dedicated Q&A time at the end of our session. So if you have questions along the way, feel free to put them into the chat, but we will have some dedicated time towards the end for any and all questions that might arise as we go through today's webinar. I am partially deaf, and so I love using closed captions because they're helpful for me. They may or may not be helpful for you. If that's something that is something you would like to use, you can simply go ahead and toggle the CC button on the bottom of your own Zoom tools. If that's something you don't need, simply make sure to toggle it off and we'll go from there. One other thing I'll mention is that while I said before, we do love using the chat, I understand that sometimes there are questions, thoughts, or comments that you may not want to share publicly with everyone. And so if that's the case, you're more than welcome to send myself or Rachel a private message during the course of our webinar. And we'll be sure to make sure that we address whatever comes up for you in that privacy space. I always like to just commit that I never share any names of folks that are asking questions privately because I understand that not everyone wants to have their name shared with something that they are curious about. So that is just a little bit of housekeeping, and let's get into it because we've got a lot to talk about. Before we get into psychological safety, however, I do want to quickly note that it is coming to the close of Pride Month. It's also National Immigrant Month, Caribbean American Heritage Month, and today, in fact, is actually the 11-year anniversary of marriage equality in the US, thanks to the landmark Obergefell versus Hodges Supreme Court case. So, just a kind of wonderful piece of history that today happens to be that 11-year mark anniversary. So, as always, I'd like to share this quickly at the top of any and all webinars that I do, just as a quick and easy way for us to practice inclusion right away from the start. All right, so with this being said and noted, let's get into psychological safety. I want to start off by making sure we all understand what exactly psychological safety is. For some of you, this may be a term that you're already really familiar with. I see that there's at least one person in the room, in the virtual room as it is, who seem to be a professor working in this space. So you may want to hop in and share some stuff that I'm missing here. For others of you, maybe this is a topic that you're not as familiar with, and that's why you're here today. So no matter where you're coming in or what curiosity has brought you to us today, we're going to just start by doing a little bit of a definition so that we can all make sure that we're on the same page in terms of what we're talking about. Now, before I go ahead and define psychological safety, I do want to note that we can't, in my mind, talk about psychological safety without recognizing that there are different kinds of safety. Psychological is just one type of safety. And these different types of safety all interplay with each other. So you'll see here on the slide that there are a few different types that I've highlighted here. So first being physical safety, which in my mind is a belief that all the risks and hazards are controlled. And in a workplace environment, we're really thinking about how are we controlling the physical space so that we are protecting all of our employees. This is really kind of represented by the fact that you feel like if you're, for example, working on site, you won't be harmed working at your company or with your colleagues. You are confident in the safety protocols that your organization has in place, whether those are policies, procedures, things put in place to handle different kinds of situations that might arise. That's all relating to our physical safety. There's also emotional safety, and I think that emotional safety tends to align really well with psychological safety. But emotional safety, how I'm defining it, is the belief that you can express yourself and your emotions authentically. And so we'll see, I think, in a minute just why these two concepts are really closely aligned. Emotional safety really lends itself to the idea that you can trust people in the workplace. You feel safe to express vulnerability. The people that you're engaging with, that you're interacting with and working with, are aware of what may or may not cause harm on different levels. And you feel like there's a sense of accountability. So these are different types of safeties that are also at play when we're talking about safety writ large. But let's move and transition into defining psychological safety. So, according to Dr. Amy Edmondson, who's the Harvard Business School professor who really came up with this term, psychological safety is a belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. A psychologically safe workplace, therefore, is one where we feel comfortable expressing our opinions, sharing ideas, and taking risks. There's open communication, there's effective collaboration. We feel safe to speak up, to push back, to offer ideas, challenge the status quo, and really contribute in a meaningful way. I just think about this from the standpoint of people need to feel safe and really, I think, feel safe on multiple levels in order to thrive and succeed. Okay, so that's how I'm defining psychological safety with the help of Dr. Edmondson. Here's my next question, and this is for you all. This is where we'll have our Slido poll come into play. So if you do have a device, make sure to get that ready to go. My question for you is, and I want you to share this, and you can either share this in the Slido that I'm going to pop up in a minute or to yourself or in the chat. What does psychological safety at work look and or feel like for you? We've already now defined psychological safety, but I want to go a little bit deeper. And what does this actually, how does this show up for you? So let me open up the Slido. Now, for those of you who've been through our webinars before or are familiar with Slido, please feel free to go ahead and jump in and start answering as you will. For those of you who this is a new tool, what you'll want to do is grab your device and you can go ahead and get that QR code and it'll put you into this poll and you'll be able to answer anonymously. If for some reason the technology is not working or you don't have a device or it's just not accessible for you today, you can also go directly to slido.com and use that code 3001928. And if all else fails, because again, sometimes technology truly is not our friend, you can just jot it down to yourself on a piece of paper or think about it in your own mind, or you're always welcome to use the chat as well. I see there are a few people in this, and this is partially why I, as a facilitator, love using Slido because virtual communication can be a little bit tricky because we're all coming together behind screens. But what I love is being able to see that, yes, we have at least one or two of you, actually at this point, it's four of you in here typing away. And so I see that we're getting some stuff come through. So the way I've set this up for today is a word cloud. So the more people who answer a specific word or phrase, the larger you see that pop up. So already we're seeing grace, open communication, clearly the very popular terms already. I'll keep reading out the rest of the terms as I see them come through. So I'm also seeing genuine warmth, mistakes, empowerment, space, the ability to contribute my perspective, joy, trust, creativity, supportive communication, laughter, questions are encouraged, being open to different ideas. Mm, love this. All right, I see there's at least one more person typing away, so we'll give it a little bit more time to make sure that you all are in here and able to share your thoughts. All right, let me see if there's anything else that I've missed. Wonderful. So this is how we today, our group here in the Inclusion Geeks webinar, this is how we are also defining psychological safety. So this is a great way for us to build on that definition I just shared and now go into what is the experience of psychological safety. So thank you all for sharing this. Because when we're thinking about a psychologically safe environment, this is all the things that you've already just brought up in that Slido word cloud, right? So we feel comfortable expressing our ideas and our opinions. We are sharing our ideas. We're taking risks. We're having that open communication. I don't know if any of you took a sneak peek at my slides, but you had that right there on the money with your word cloud. Open communication, effective collaboration, increased productivity, and overall team success. These are the hallmarks of a psychologically safe environment. And when psychological safety is present, these are the ways that we are able to see that that's effective and that's actually happening in the culture and the environment that we're trying to create and be part of in a workplace context. This is going to create atmospheres where each of us as individuals feel supported, respected, and honestly confident in expressing ourselves without that fear of judgment. And that's going to lead us to that positive and inclusive organizational culture. So I'm going to go through the next bit a bit briefly because I don't think I need to really spend a lot of time convincing you all about why psychological safety matters. But in case anyone is still thinking to yourself, like, is this really that important or not? I will argue that yes, it's crucial to having healthy and successful workplaces. And again, this is the belief that we can speak up and take risks and that we can grow and stretch and that we can try out different things without having that fear of a negative consequence. Just like a physical safety net, if you were going to go bungee jumping, for example, or doing something more active, that would protect you from possible harm, right? Psychological safety provides more of a metaphorical net that allows you to take these calculated risks and learn from the mistakes without having it turn into a total catastrophe. So here are some key reasons why psychological safety is so important in my mind in the workplace. So first, it does show that we see increased innovation and creativity. When people feel safe to share their ideas, even if they're unconventional, it fosters this culture and this sense of innovation. I've said this multiple times already, but we're more likely to take risks, experiment, and come up with new solutions when we know that our ideas will not be met with ridicule or dismissal. This will lead to breakthroughs and, trying new things, improvements in all areas of business. We also see improved collaboration and teamwork. And so, again, psychological safety creates an environment where we feel comfortable working together and sharing information. This leads to better collaboration, better engagement, better teamwork, because we're more willing to trust each other and support each other. Strong teams are going to be more productive, efficient, and able to achieve more than just an individual working alone. We also see enhanced learning and development. When we feel safe to ask questions and admit mistakes, that creates an environment of continuous learning and development. We are more likely to learn from an experience and grow if we know we will not be punished for making a mistake. And I do want to note really quickly, because sometimes this comes up as a sticking point when I talk about psychological safety in spaces like this, especially from managers and leaders who are thinking to themselves, okay, I support psychological safety. I'm on board. But what if the employee or what if the person, really makes a truly egregious misstep? And I do want to note that there is a separation here, right? Because we're talking about mistakes where maybe it's a different style or it's something that's not as ginormous or it's a bit more of a minor mistake. And depending on your managerial or your leadership style, I'm sure we've all worked for folks where making the smallest mistake will turn into a huge catastrophe, right? And for some of us who are thinking back to experiences like this, we're already starting to sweat a little bit, having that memory of making a fumble and having to admit it or not admitting it because of the fear of what the blowback will be. I want to note that that's different than making a mistake that is truly, something in the realm of like sexual harassment or something that is a fireable offense or something that's truly egregious. So just for any of my leaders and managers here, there is a difference there that can be nuanced, but that I do want to note that we're talking about sort of two different things here when we're talking about making mistakes in the workplace. All right. Next thing I want to note is increased employee retention. So, employees who feel more psychologically safe are more likely to be satisfied with their jobs and stay with their employers and their companies longer. So, this can save money on recruitment and training costs. You don't have to continually be onboarding new people. And it also can lead to a more experienced and more stable workforce. You're retaining people, you're retaining institutional knowledge, you're retaining ways of working where people have learned from past experiences and are able to apply that to the future. And so I really think that psychological safety in this regard, especially, is not just a nice to have. It can be a really critical part of a successful workplace because by creating these environments where everyone feels safe to be themselves and to contribute their best work, the organization is going to benefit from that. Finally, reduced stress and burnout. Now, if we're all on the same page in today's world, 2026, it's a stressful world. There is a lot going on. I can't spend any time getting into that because we'll spend the rest of our webinar just talking about all the different things that are creating stress and burnout in today's world. But the reality is that there is a lot going on. And so when we're thinking about the workplace in and of itself, if we are able to create and maintain a psychologically safe workplace, that really will be a huge help for us in terms of reducing stress and burnout in the workplace specifically. We can only control what we control. So we may not be able to control the other stressors that are happening outside of the workplace, but we can think about how can we mitigate stress in the workplace. Again, when people feel comfortable expressing concerns, expressing ideas, asking for help, it can prevent employees from feeling overwhelmed and isolated. This will lead to happier, healthier, and more engaged employees. This leads me to the next topic that I want to talk about, which is resiliency. And that was part of what we promised you all with the title of today's webinar, which is building resilient teams. So it's not just about building a psychologically safe workplace, but really thinking about how are we incorporating resiliency into this. So let's start off with what is resilience? Now, I have a definition. I didn't put up a Slido poll for this one, but I do have a definition in mind that I'm about to share with you all. But I would love to hear from maybe at least one or two folks in chat if you have an idea about how you define resiliency or resilience. So, anyone have a thought around how you would define resilience, or even maybe a couple key words that are coming to mind when you think about this concept? Let me know in chat what you're coming up with. I'll give it like 30 seconds or so. What words come to mind when you think of resilience? Coping skills, overcoming setbacks, recovery from setbacks, the ability to easily adapt to change, rupture and repair. Ooh, I like that one, Genevieve. Ability to bounce back, recovery, return, ability to handle whatever is thrown at you, flexibility. Yes, lots of good stuff here. So keep it coming if you're still typing away on the back end. I'll keep an eye on the chat, come back to this. But great things. Let me add to this with my definition of resilience. So I like to start really broad and narrow down. So, in terms of defining what resilience is, there are a lot of definitions out there. I do want to note that, but typically, a lot of researchers and experts do agree that resilience is very complex and complicated. As a construct, it can have different meanings depending on the individual, the company, the culture that we're operating in, the context, the society that we live in. But resilience also isn't static. And I do want to note before I read through this definition that we could exhibit a lot of resilience at one point in our lives, and then at another point in our lives, not so much. So it can change, and we may have the ability to have more resilience in one area than in others, and that's completely fine and normal. So here's my, what I will say, working definition, because I'm always open to shifting and changing as I learn and grow. And some of what you all have offered in chat is already represented in here. And there may be other things that I will think about adding in the future. But the way that I currently think about resilience is the capacity to adapt, rebound, or bounce back from adversity, conflict, failure, or honestly, even increased responsibility. Resilience is enhanced through our connections with each other and is influenced by our identities. So, in the most simplified form, the key to resilience is trying really, really hard, then stopping, recovering, and then you try again. So there's really a very clear tie here to positive psychology and positive emotions, even though that connection is, I will be honest, still being analyzed and researched. But some researchers are looking at resilience as a positive coping psychological resource, along with other resources and emotions like optimism and hope. And one way to build resilience is by simply talking to yourself with a positive mindset or spin. That may or may not be accessible for everyone, and I'll just note that at various points in my own life. I'm like, that's just not something that I'm here for. And in other parts of my life, it's really helpful. So, again, this is something that can ebb and flow as you move through life and are dealing with whatever you're dealing with. So, don't feel like if you're not in that headspace that all is lost, because again, these are things that may or may not be more sort of striking your fancy or not, as the case may be. A lot of us, when we go through, a problem or a challenging situation or a complicated dynamic that we're kind of trying to explore a little bit, in those cases, for a lot of us, resilience is about pushing ourselves through or pushing ourselves to do our best, powering through adversity. If that feels familiar to you, put a plus or a one in the chat. I know it sometimes is how I think about being resilient. And this is usually talked about in really positive terms, like, oh, she's so resilient, just takes everything that's thrown at her, right? But again, I do want to note that being too resilient can lead to burnout, exhaustion, or perpetuating sometimes harmful situations. So, what I mean by that is we might tolerate a negative or harmful situation for too long because we're trying to be resilient. So, a lot of times we think about resilience at both a macro and micro level. So, macro level, really big issues, right? So, going through a divorce, rebuilding after a natural disaster, recovering from a major illness. Micro resilience, which is kind of more what we're talking about with regards to psychological safety, are more of those like everyday actions that create a space and environment that allow you to handle the exhaustion, the stress, the burnout, all the things that I've already talked about here. All right, so that's resiliency. Let's shift now into talking a little bit more about how can we build a resilient team. So we know that when employees feel comfortable asking for help, sharing suggestions, or challenging the status quo without having that fear of a negative consequence, the organization is more likely to innovate, adapt, and thrive. However, just because we know this doesn't mean that managers and leaders always demonstrate the kinds of behaviors and leadership styles that can support and grow a psychologically safe environment. So there is that gap between knowledge and application. And so this is around really what I want to talk through, because it's not enough to just know that these are the things that we need to do. It's also about how do we actually do the things that we want to do. So, this image is from a McKinsey global survey that was conducted during the pandemic. And what it shows is a couple specific leadership behaviors that can help employees to thrive. In recent years, we've seen a shift away from a more traditional command and control leadership style, which is known, especially in this case, as authoritative leadership. So that's kind of outlined over here on the left-hand side. The survey shows that this style of leadership is actually detrimental to psychological safety. Not super surprising, I don't think, but it's always good to have research and data to back us up, right? So, consultative and supportive leadership behaviors actually are shown to promote psychological safety. Leaders, in and of themselves, can further enhance psychological safety by ensuring a positive team climate. Now, if you're like me and you're like, wait, okay, so what are we talking about when we're talking about these different styles? What does consultative mean? What does supportive leadership mean? I'll be happy to define that for you. Consultative leadership briefly means that in this leadership style, the leader is consulting their team members, they're asking for input, and they're considering the team's views on issues that affect the team. It doesn't mean that the leadership is totally giving over decision-making powers or authority to the team members, but they're very actively engaging with the team and the employees to get their input, and they're literally consulting with the team. Supportive leadership involves leaders demonstrating concern and support for their team members, not just as employees, but also as individuals. That one's an interesting one, and I think that could probably be a whole other webinar topic in the future about the, I guess, like the pros and cons of supportive leadership and different other leadership styles. But again, that's really about holistically seeing your employees as a full human being, not just as someone who is punching in and punching out and, sort of only a worker bee, so to speak. So really, again, I think this ties back to what I was referring to earlier in our webinar, which is around that idea that, we're talking here about the workplace as sort of a construct and a space and the context for everything that we're talking about today. And life is not simply all work, right? So there's a lot of other stuff going on. And so I think supportive leadership really leans into this acknowledgement and appreciation that we are full of people and there's a lot of stuff going on in our lives that may not necessarily be limited just to what's happening at work. So you'll know here that this image does offer us another style of leadership, which is known as challenging leadership. So this set of leadership behaviors, it's really interesting because it can sometimes strengthen psychological safety. However, only when there is already a positive team climate in place. So this particular leadership style, this challenging leadership style, encourages your employees rather, to do more than they think they initially can do. So this one is an interesting one because it's about pushing your people. But what the survey results really showed is that the highest likelihood of psychological safety occurs when the team lead, the manager, the leader, whatever that title is going to be, has first created a positive team climate through frequent supportive actions, through consultative actions, and then challenges the team. So you start off with consulting, you're being supportive, and then you go into challenge. If you don't have that foundation of a positive climate, if you go right to challenging first, what they found is that those challenging behaviors didn't really have any significant effect in terms of the climate. So I'll pause there and just do a quick look at the chat to see if there's any questions there, because I think this is really fascinating. And as someone who has led teams and has managed and has tried out different variations of these leadership styles, I think the key takeaway for me was really thinking about how do I start off by building the base for what I want and then moving into pushing people. And I think it makes sense if you really think about it. Like it seems pretty straightforward, right? If you go straight away to challenging without building that foundation of trust, that's probably not going to do as well for you as if you already have that foundation in place. So, with all this in mind, how do we create a positive team climate beyond just being consultative and supportive leaders? So, a climate that's really conducive to psychological safety, I really truly believe that it's everyone's job, but it also starts at the very top of an organization. You can foster a positive team climate through these 5 high-level actions. So let me talk through each one of these. First, use the platinum rule. Now, before I go any further, I want to check in with you all. Who here has already heard of the platinum rule? Put a plus or a 1 in the chat if you're familiar. If this is something that's new to you or you're not sure, put a dash or a 0 in the chat. And I'm seeing Rachel saying it's your favorite. Well, I know that, Rachel. I agree. It's my favorite too. All right. So a couple pluses, a lot of zeros. Okay, great. So we got a bit of a mixed bag here. So I will be more than happy to explain what the platinum rule is because, as Rachel's already noted, it's one of our favorite things to talk about. So for some of you, you may be thinking to yourself, oh, okay, especially for those of us who grew up in the US, I think that this is something that was talked a lot about in grade school. I grew up personally on the East Coast, and so I remember being in first grade, being taught about the golden rule, which is treat others the way that you want to be treated. And that's probably what's really familiar to a lot of you. I think that's great. I have nothing against the golden rule. I think people should absolutely practice it. The platinum rule goes one step further and says instead of treating others the way that you want to be treated, it's about treating others the way that they want to be treated. And I love that concept because what we talk about a lot here at Inclusion Geeks is the idea that we are all different, unique people. And while there's areas in which we overlap and we have similarities and we have maybe similar backgrounds, experiences, identities, we also have a lot of differences. And so what works for me may not work for Rachel or may not work for you all, right? And so I may be treating you the way that I like to be treated, but that might be completely opposite to the way that you would like to be treated. And so if I'm just looking at my team through my own personal lens, I may be thinking that I'm doing a really great job of being that consultative, that supportive leadership, but in reality, I might be more of that authoritarian leader, right? And so that's really where the platinum rule comes into play. It's really about, again, having that respect and that engagement, but thinking about your employees and really putting yourself, if you're the manager or the leader, in their shoes. And in some cases, and I get this a lot, people will ask me, okay, well, how would I know how my employee wants to be treated? Simply just ask them. Now, there's a whole lot of ways we can, ask our employees for that, but that's one of the simplest ways to start. So, first things first, you can use the platinum rule. Second thing that you can do is encourage curiosity. So, really, this is about asking questions. Again, rewarding people for asking questions, not getting annoyed if questions are being asked. And I know that depending on the industry and what's going on and the projects that you're working on, sometimes this one gets tricky because you might think to yourself, well, these questions are slowing it down, or why are people asking these questions? They should already know the answers. And so there's obviously always going to be a balance here. But really, in terms of that lens of curiosity, that's what you want to see, because if people are curious, if they are engaged, if they are asking questions, that is a hallmark of the fact that you're building that positive, psychologically safe climate because people feel safe to do so. If people don't feel safety, they will not be asking questions. They won't be curious. They'll just be showing up and doing the work and not really engaging any further. So, really encouraging that kind of curiosity. You'll want to welcome, and I have this sort of noted here, healthy conflict. Now, I don't think it's great to have workspaces where everything is in conflict and everyone's butting heads at all times, because that's going to ultimately be detrimental to the environment, to your work, to your team. But I do think that on the flip side, you don't want to have an environment where everyone just says yes all the time to go along to get along. And this is where sometimes, and this is going back to, I think, what I hinted at with that supportive leadership style, sometimes this is an unintended consequence when you're too supportive as a leader because you just don't want to have conflict. You just want everyone to, be friends or do well together. And so you just sort of say yes to everything, or you kind of avoid hard discussions or challenging conversations. But there is a place for healthy conflict in a psychologically safe, positive team climate environment. And what I mean by that is that we shouldn't always all agree. We should push back on each other. And so this is, again, it can be challenging and tricky because there is a delicate balance here, but you want to have people push back on you, analyze something, interrogate an idea in the context and structures that you're setting up for them. One thing Rachel and I always talk about with our team members is we always say, we want people who will push back on us. And the reason we say that is not because we want to work in an environment at Inclusion Geeks where we're always having to struggle or have fights or hard discussions, but we want to get checked. We want to acknowledge that we are human beings, and while we think we're really smart and have great ideas, and I would say not just think, I'm pretty sure that's the truth, we also know that, we have our own lenses and we have our own experiences, and we want others on the team to push back and provide alternatives, provide, different opinions, different viewpoints, and really that's going to get us to a space where we have this positive climate. I think this aligns really well with the next point, which is give your employees a voice. So if you are on a team where really there's just one or two people who are listened to and heard, that's not going to get you to that positive climate. Some of us work on small teams. Some of us work on really large teams. Some of us don't know who our manager is because we work on a team of 50 or 100 people. Others, it's very intimate, right? So everyone's coming at this from a different perspective. But if you are thinking about this from a managerial perspective, you can think about both, that one-on-one sort of how are you talking to and hearing from your people. You could also be thinking about are there maybe anonymous ways that you're doing things like pulse surveys or gathering input or allowing people to vote on things, right? So really giving your employees a voice in decisions and projects and work that they're engaged in. And then the last point is earn and extend trust. And this is something that's developed over time. It's not something that you can necessarily come out the gate with. I've highlighted trust because I want to double click on that last point a little bit further. So when I'm thinking about trust, I'm really thinking about the idea that we're really believing that the other party or the other people that we're engaging with won't cause us harm. We can rely on each other to act in ways that are beneficial, honest, fair, and reliable. This definition comes from Deloitte, and according to them, only 16% of workers in this big survey that they did in 2024 responded that they have a very high level of trust in their employer. So I'll repeat that again. They did this big survey. They asked, do you have a very high level of trust in your employer? And only 16%, 1/6 of the people who were part of the survey responded yes. And I think that that's really telling because, again, as leaders, as managers, we have a big responsibility to not only build trust within our workplace, but to also go back to that idea of psychological safety. We also have a responsibility to create the psychological safety that's necessary in order to get to that point. And this idea of trust is really about that willingness to be vulnerable, that we can't do it all by ourselves. So we do need others to have them help us out, to cooperate with them, to lift up the work that we're doing. But in order to be mutually vulnerable, we need to feel empathy and that sense of psychological safety. So at this point, I've already given some ideas, but I want to kind of go into this a little bit deeper and talk more specifically about how can we build trust in the workplace as managers and leaders. So I'm going to go through first from this perspective of managers and leaders, and then I'm going to wrap up towards the end with how individual contributors, how a solo employee can also be doing this work too, because I recognize that not all of you on the webinar today may be in a managerial or a leadership position. But again, as I said at the start of this webinar, I truly believe this is everybody's work to be doing. So as an inclusive manager, here are a few tips that you can keep in mind. So first, lead by example. So I've already highlighted this, but you want to model the behaviors that you want to see. So if you want people to be vulnerable with you, if you want them to take accountability, you need to do the same thing yourself, because I will tell you the quickest way to lose your team, to move away from that goal of psychologically safety that you're aiming for, the very quickest way to get away from all of that is to say one thing and do another. And employees will absolutely call you out on this if that's something that you're doing. So another way you can also lead by example is by providing constructive feedback. So this is where you're also modeling, but then you're giving feedback to the folks that you're working with. You want to make sure that you're establishing clear norms and expectations, because you want to make sure that you're not just telling people or asking them to do something and not giving them boundaries with which how you want them to do that. You want to also think about developing team-based strategies for, things like active listening. How are we celebrating mistakes? How are we engaging with each other? So these are ground rules basically for how are we communicating? How are we working with each other? How do we make sure that we are going to be doing and practicing the behaviors that we want to see? And then open communication. This is again about encouraging those questions, leaning into the active listening, having respect for all voices. Don't assume you know everything or that your reports will always get it right. You will not always get it right. They won't always get it right. Make sure that you're actively soliciting input and feedback, because even if you're modeling the right behavior, you can't assume that everyone will tell you what they're thinking. So this is where, in the sense of communication, you could be asking open-ended questions like, what are you seeing? What are your thoughts on this? What's your take on this idea? One thing that I really love as a manager, in terms of asking questions, is when I'm working on a project with a team, I try to not always give my idea first or my take first, because I want to create space for others to really come into that, right? So sometimes with a team, they'll be like, well, what do you think? Or what do you want to see? And I'll say, well, first, what do you think? What do you see? Because I don't want to necessarily bias the responses by giving my response or my thought process first. And again, this is where you're going to be encouraging that culture of curiosity. Three more tips before we close out this bit here is you want to think about celebrating failures. So it's not just enough to say, yes, we're going to lean into celebrating the mistakes and learning from them. How are you going to do that? This is around normalizing humility, admitting when you made a mistake, showing what you learned from it. Did you learn anything from it? Would you make the same mistake again? I don't know. These are things you need to think about and talk about. Shift and reframe a mistake into a growth and learning opportunity. I had a former manager at the very beginning of my career where every time someone made a mistake in this kind of sense of building out a more psychologically safe environment, he would literally take a bell and ring it. We were a smaller company, so this was a bit more doable. He would take a bell and ring it and call out teachable moment. And I always kind of remember that in my mind because it was such a great way to reframe the mistake. And yes, I mean, you can still be embarrassed or be upset that you made the mistake, or, we can be not thrilled that this happened, but it was a really great way to reframe it. And the bell ringing was a way to allow everybody to sort of learn from that reframe and what was happening. So it wasn't just limited to the individual who may have made the mistake along the way. Relatedly, small wins matter too. And so I really like to emphasize this because a lot of times, especially as managers and leaders, we think, okay, we're really focused on the big things, right? The big picture project, the big client, the big push that we're aiming for. But sometimes it's actually the smaller items that are more meaningful because those are really what show that we're making progress along the way. And so even if it's an incremental step towards a goal or a behavior or something that you're aiming for, make sure to celebrate those as well. And then finally, provide some options to build trust. And so this is where it's great to say, I want you to trust me, but give people an opportunity to build that trust with you. One last thing I want to note before moving on is a really interesting point, which I haven't brought up until now, which, and again, this is a longer discussion for another time, but there is some new research that's just coming out that's showing us that middle managers are actually the ones who feel the least psychologically safe in the workplace. Sometimes even they feel less psychologically safe than the people they manage. So I want to note that because for my leaders in the room, this is even more critical for you to keep in mind all of these different tips that I'm sharing here. All right, now to close this out before we go into Q&A, I have a couple final things to just keep in mind. So these are some final actions, first from the managerial side, and then I'm going to close out with individual contributor side. So some additional actions as a manager or a leader that you can take include focusing on self-awareness. So really being aware of how you show up and what's going on with you. Lead with empathy. Don't just default to assuming the worst. Lead with empathy. Again, this is about thinking about our people as holistic, full human beings. Allow for constructive risk taking, but keep accountability top of mind. So, again, treat an honest mistake as a learning opportunity. But if there's repeated negligence or egregious behaviors that are happening, you need to hold people responsible. Try not to be reactive or defensive, and this can be a hard one. So, this is really a practice for a lot of folks. So, trying to kind of maybe quash down your initial reaction and just kind of maybe lean more into that lens of curiosity. Get curious. That's a really important one. Lead by example. So you can set the tone for a positive climate that you want to maintain. Because if you have employees who you want to behave in a certain way, they're more likely to exhibit those kinds of supportive and consultative behaviors if you and your leaders are also already behaving in that way. So again, this could be seeking out an opinion that's different from yours, treating others with respect, sharing your own mistakes. What did you get wrong? What did you learn from it? Use critical thinking to challenge your own assumptions, and then finally amplify the contributions of your employees. So if they contributed something, if they were a big piece of a project, highlight that, celebrate it, love on that. All right, finally, for those of us who are like, okay, well, I'm not a manager, I'm not a leader, Felicia, so like some of this makes sense, but I can't actually do all of it. Everyone can do things to help create these kinds of climates. So if you're more of an individual contributor, what you can do is focus on finding solutions. And this is where you can use questions like, what can we all do? Or what can I do to help solve this problem? Ask your teammates for their opinions. This could be asking someone else a question like, I'd love to get your feedback on this idea. You can actively listen to the ideas shared by your colleagues, your team leads, your managers. You can ask respectful questions, and that's where that pushback can kind of come into play. You can extend kindness and respect when team members are sharing ideas that you may not agree with. So, again, how do we react or how do we engage when we're not all on the same page? And then finally, you can provide thoughtful feedback to others in a respectful, thoughtful way. Okay, so we have just under 15 minutes left to go into some Q&A. So, what I would love to do is if folks have questions, please feel free to put those in the chat. You can also use the raise hand feature and we'll unmute you. I do have a question or two that were shared in advance through the Eventbrite. So, if there's no immediate questions in the room, I can go through and answer some of those pre-submitted questions. But I'll take about 30 seconds first to see if there's any burning questions in the chat at this point before we go into the Eventbrite questions. What is top of mind for folks? What are you still noodling on? Is there a situation that you're thinking through that you're like, I'm not entirely sure how this would apply to that? Let us know. And you're also more than welcome to share a private question as well if you're like, I don't really want to share my question with everybody. Okay, so I got a couple questions come through. So I'll start off with the first one I see in the chat, which is, can I talk a little bit more about celebrating mistakes? Yeah, so like I said, one way that I've experienced this in the past, in my own work experience, is when someone made a mistake. I don't even remember. This was more than 20 years ago, so I can't remember offhand what an example of the mistake would be. But let's say it was something like, I don't know, like let's say you emailed an important client and you called them the wrong name in the email. I'm just making that up because I truly don't remember what kind of mistakes we used to make back in the day. But that's where the manager that I mentioned, let's say I would go to the person, I'd be like, oh my gosh, I'm so embarrassed. Like I called them the wrong name and now they're really mad at me. And so he would get his little bell out, he'd ring it, and he'd be like, teachable moment, teachable moment. And then again, because this is sort of a more of a made-up example, what I feel like he probably could have done and what I would do as a manager if this were a mistake that someone came to me with is I would say, okay, so yes, not great that the client's, not happy with this. We need to make sure we're doing better. I might solicit ideas from the group and say, how could we fix this in the future? So again, that's not just me coming in with my solution right away, but giving folks the space or even the person who made the mistake the space to answer or reflect. This is where, again, as a manager, I can guide it so people aren't coming up with ideas or if they're going off in a direction that maybe is not super helpful, I can kind of pull them back in and say, yes, that's, an interesting idea, so and so, but maybe, maybe we just do a quick 30-second review and do a double check before we send an email out. Or maybe we implement that 30-second callback. I know that some email systems have that now where you can quickly do the undo button before the email gets officially sent out, right? So that's one way of doing it. Another way is, again, just really kind of talking people through and reframing it. So think of yourself in this sense, if you're the manager, almost like a business therapist. Someone comes to you, they made a mistake. Your job isn't to yell at them or, castigate them. Your job is to support and reframe and say, yes, this wasn't great. How can we reframe this? How can we fix this? How can we think about this in the future? I'll never forget one of my first big mistakes, if you will, in my corporate life was one of the first years I worked for a really large company. I was making good money. I went ahead and I bought a ton of fancy gifts for my family for Christmas. And by accident, I put it all on my business credit card, not my personal credit card. And I truly went into my manager's office thinking I was about to get fired. I was crying in the bathroom, and he was incredibly kind and basically said, yeah, not great, but you know what? We all have made this mistake before. Here's how you fix it. Not a big deal. If anyone, has issues with it, tell them to talk to me. And I will never forget that moment because it was such a great example of how a different manager could have yelled at me, gotten really upset, penalized me in different ways. But the kindness that my manager showed me, it was truly an honest mistake. And the kindness he showed me and reframing it and downplaying it was something that I'll never forget. So a couple of quick examples from my own personal experience there. Okay, so I see there's a lot more questions coming through, so let me kind of go through the next couple of ones. What were the reasons behind why middle managers feel the least psychologically safe? Yes, I don't have the exact reasons top of mind, but let me pull up that research report, and what we can do is we'll send that out with the recap of this webinar so that folks can read it through at their leisure. So thank you for asking about that. We'll make a note and pull that out for you. All right, next question. How can we help quiet reports who don't speak up? Adding to that, the more quiet and introverted don't speak up. or sorry, let me reread this. The more quiet and introverted do not, based on this person's experience, tend to like their successes amplified loudly. You got it. And then we already have an answer, which I love. So Stephanie answered that Stephanie likes to ask folks directly how they prefer to be recognized. I love that. Stephanie, what a great example of the platinum rule in action right there. Like kudos to you for that, right? Because I might want a shout out or, an all hands call out in front of everybody. Other folks might, that might be the worst moment of their lives. So ask people how they want to be recognized. And there's some great examples for how that could be played out that Stephanie's given already in the chat. Going back to Serenity's original question around how to help quiet reports who don't speak up. So I would say for you, if you're in the position of helping and you're sort of the manager leadership role here, the team lead role, I would also want you to think about what is your ultimate goal? Like, what are you aiming for when you're wanting to get them to speak up more? Is it because you know they have good ideas and they're just not getting shared? Is it because you want them to speak more? Is it because there's a norm that speaking up in a meeting versus sharing an idea in some other way is more rewarded or more valued? So I'd also want to think about that a little bit. There also are always considerations to keep in mind, like gender dynamics. Again, what is your current team climate already like? Is it conducive to having people speak up or not? Has there been pushback when people have spoken up and gotten, talked over or their ideas ignored? Is there language things to keep in mind? Is everyone's first working language the same? Here in the US, we typically work in English, but not everyone may have English as their first language. And so maybe that might be something that you want to keep in mind. And so again, there's a whole host of things to keep in mind, but I would say there's always the consideration of if someone's not fully comfortable, perhaps speaking up in the moment in a meeting, whether that's virtual or in person, could there be alternative channels that you could get ideas? So maybe you can ask this person to send you ideas in advance. You could set up a Slack or a chat during a meeting so people can type stuff out as opposed to speaking it if that's how they feel more comfortable. So just be really curious, be creative, and be open to different ways of working that may not all be the same exact way because not all your employees will show up in the same way. All right, next question is how might leaders better define mistakes that fall in the gray area? Meaning not a fireable mistake, but also not a minor mistake that doesn't impact business. Yeah, this is the where the work is, right? This is the real work. The stuff that's not super, wild. It's not, super minor, but it's not a fireable offense, but it's something you want to address. So I would say this is something where if you're the manager, I think everyone thinks about this stuff differently. So some organizations, this might be something that you literally have like spelled out. So, maybe this is something that could even be a thought exercise for you. What does count as a minor mistake? List out everything you can think of. Calling the client by the wrong first name, right? Leaving someone off an email invite or a calendar invite. I don't know, right? There could be all sorts of examples of minor mistakes. What counts as a fireable offense? That's probably a lot easier for you because there's probably already policies in place and language in place in your employee handbook and your HR policies, if you have that, around what counts as a fireable offense. And then everything else is in the middle, right? So that's where you have sort of the discretion as a manager, I would say, that you could probably treat each situation in a unique capacity. So again, I think that two things can be true at the same time. You can reframe a medium level mistake, if, as it were, as a learning opportunity, and you can still hold people accountable for it. So, there could be things to be learned and you still might maybe not get the promotion that the person's hoping for, or maybe the bonus is impacted, or maybe the employee doesn't get the perk that the other folks get for good behavior. I don't know, right? This is really going to depend on your unique organization, your team, and how you're set up. But I think that accountability piece is the big differentiating factor there. So there's a really big difference between telling someone, hey, just make sure you like double check your email next time versus saying, hey, I get it, mistakes happen. We're going to learn from this, and here's what's happening because of this. All right. Next question is any ideas on how we can ensure that these actions don't become performative? For example, actively listening, soliciting opinions, and being vulnerable, and then ignoring all that to make the decision independently or disregard the conversation completely. I think that's exactly it, Stephanie. So I think it's about saying if you want to create these kinds of environments and you're asking people to exhibit and practice and display certain behaviors, you have to show follow through. That's the biggest piece right there. And I think that when we at Inclusion Geeks work with middle managers, leaders, that's probably the biggest piece of the puzzle right there, is saying, it's not one way for your employees and a different way for you. We all have to be on the same page. So if you're asking your folks to show up, you have to show up the same way too. That's just a conversation, that's practicing, that's doing the work. And I would say that, if you are seeing issues in this area, then there's probably further work to be done at the senior level around what are their goals and is this something they actually want as a climate and a culture? And are they willing to put in that level of work to get there? And that's, I think, the best way to approach it. Okay. So thank you all so much. These are great questions. If there's any other questions that come up in the meantime, after the webinar concludes, feel free to send them our way. We are always more than happy to chat further and engage. But before we wrap, I do want to note that our next webinar coming up is in July, and it's going to be all about bridging generational gaps at work. So if you're like, hey, I'm working with a lot of different people from different ages, how can I do things better, or I've got these issues, come chat with us because we're going to talk all about it. So that's going to be on July 29th. We have some more stuff coming up to close out Q3. I've also put the QR code up on the screen, so you can go ahead and grab that before you hop. And we'll be following up with the recording, follow-up survey, resources, all that good stuff. But thank you all so much for being here today. Really appreciate you, the great questions, and all the things that you brought to our conversation. It's always a pleasure. And finally, if anyone does have any burning questions, you're more than welcome to reach out to us at facilitators@inclusiongeeks.com or hi@inclusiongeeks.com, and we will get back to you as quickly as we can. Thank you all for being here, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. See you next time.